May God add a blessing to the reading and the hearing of this holy word. Will you pray with me? Holy One, oil the hinges of our heart's doors, that they might swing easily open to welcome you. Amen. So many of us needed those words of comfort this week in the wake of news that two of our well-loved members of Saugatuck Church had died, both Paul Van Orden and Anne Salmond. For those of us who knew them, it's been a sad few days. Loss layered upon loss. Both Anne and Paul lived remarkable, faithful lives, shared their gifts with the world all around them, and so sadness is mixed in with admiration and gratitude, but still, we miss them. Even those of you who don't know Anne and Paul may well respond to God's words of assurance in today's reading. Who among us doesn't crave comfort? Who hasn't suffered a personal loss or illness or distress somewhere along the way? Who hasn't laid awake in the middle of the night, worrying over a pile of bills, the well-being of the children, or the status of our society? It's become almost a cliche to mention the divisions in our country. What feels to many of us like heightened tensions and sharper divisions between neighbors, the kind that strain the bonds of civility and threaten to undermine the festive mood when extended family gathers for Thanksgiving dinner. And even more sobering, we know that loneliness has reached chronic proportions in our nation and indeed around the world, so that the UK has actually appointed a minister of loneliness to address the epidemic in Great Britain. I think we need to get one of those. At the Pivot Ministries Gala last night, attended by 18 members of Saugatuck Church and scores of other Pivot supporters, the executive director, Richard Williams, reminded us that somewhere in every family there are people who have been affected by the vagaries of addiction. And recent articles in my Facebook feed report that young people and middle-aged men in our country are ending their own lives in increasing numbers. Comfort, comfort, O my people, says our God. Of course, we are not the first to experience such discombobulated lives. The words we hear this morning were first uttered in the wake of a devastating loss for the Israelites. The Babylonians had invaded their kingdom, destroyed their capital city, exiled the people, scattered them all across the land. In some ways, akin to the experience of native peoples here in North America, the Israelites were unmoored and their way of life upended, so that their very identity as a people was put in jeopardy. Other prophets, most notably Jeremiah and Ezekiel, blamed the Israelites for their plight, suggesting that it was their own lack of faithfulness to God that had brought on this calamity, that God had turned God's back on them. But then, enter Isaiah, replacing those words of shame and blame with words of assurance. Like a healing balm poured out, God has not abandoned you. On the contrary, God is on the way to end your suffering and to restore your fortunes. Thunder in the desert. Prepare for God's arrival, declared the prophet. Or in the more familiar translation, the one quoted by John the Baptist, as related in the Gospel of John, "Prepare a way in the wilderness. Make the road straight and smooth, a highway fit for our God. Fill in the valleys, level off the hills, smooth out the ruts, clear out the rocks. And then God's bright glory will shine, and everyone will see it." How badly do we need to hear that? The promise that God is on the move. How like the Israelites are we, longing for a little divine transformation in the wilderness, whether that wilderness is addiction or isolation, poverty, or the literal wilderness occupied by countless seekers of asylum at our southern border or halfway around the globe. Everywhere I go, I hear those words of longing. And so it is the invitation to shout, to speak loud and clear that caught my ear this week, along with that invitation to make a way. Like every generation before us, we need to hear a word of hope to restore the soul. Hope that God remains God, faithful, powerful, and determined to mend all the broken places. Friends, this is why we have church. We are the proclaimers, the ones called to shout out from the rooftops and to point to the promise. We are the ones called to testify to the evidence that desperation and despair are no match for God's love and justice. But we only announce it because someone else told us first. Someone showed us what hope looks like, what love feels like. Someone cleared the way for us when we needed it most. Maybe that someone was Anne Salmond or Paul Van Orden. Maybe it was Dan Long or Jane Mangold or Betty Rayla or Margaret Inling. Maybe you were sharing coffee with Paul one day when he leaned over in that characteristic way and asked you a question, and then another, and listened deeply so that you felt like your story really mattered. Maybe you still remember that, the way Paul empowered the God Spirit in you. Or maybe Jane cornered you in the hall one morning and asked you to write an article for our Herald newsletter so that the rest of the church would know about the work that you were doing. Maybe she's the one who reminded you that it's important for us to tell our stories. Maybe Dan crossed the room to welcome you during fellowship hour, the first time you came to church, greeted you with that smile that lit up his face, and so gave you a small taste of God's beloved community. Or maybe you met Anne while she and Willie still served as missionaries in Uganda, and so you learned about her fierce commitment to children, especially those living with AIDS. Maybe her commitment even inspired you to ask how you might use your own gifts to make a difference in God's world. And if you joined us on the youth mission trip to the Navajo Nation last June, maybe you met Brian Anderson's brother Caleb, one of the high schoolers who joined us after Brian himself died in a car accident last December and had his memorial service here in this sanctuary. Maybe you've heard Caleb testify to the ways that Brian loved his family and left his mark on Caleb's spirit during that too short life. Every one of the saints, for whom we will light a candle this morning, did something to help pave the way toward greater love and justice. Knowing that, it is tempting to lean on them long after they have gone, to think they were the real leaders, the pillars, irreplaceable. But Dan, Jane, Anne, Margaret, all of them understood that the church is always remaking itself, renewing itself, always being transformed. And it seems to me that this is the work of the church in every generation. In light of struggle and suffering, to clear that path that leads to justice and mercy, hope and healing. Those who came before, the ones we now call saints, they have passed the mantle to all of us. It may well have been their witness that inspired our own, but now it's our turn to share the good news, to show others what hope looks like, what love feels like. Now it is our turn to keep our eyes peeled for evidence of God's approach and to do our part together to make a way, to welcome and listen and serve and bless and proclaim God's unwavering love to all who long to hear it. Do that. Do it faithfully, the best we know how, supporting each other as we go. And I trust, along with the prophet Isaiah, that here at Saugatuck Church and in all the lives we touch, God's bright glory will indeed shine, and everyone will see it.